He looked out the window downtown Toronto. He said, "See, there's the CN Tower just been built. If I looked out and saw a man climbing that tower, that would be a news story. If I saw a woman climbing the tower, it would be a women's story." I suppressed my hysterical laughter and said, "Oh, I see, Marty." And I took the job thinking that they don't know what they've got. And every column I wrote from day one was a feminist column. It was taking news stories or current events and looking at them through a feminist lens.
Much has been written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors about feminism and the equality movement. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life. We want to add more. The Women's History Project is a nonprofit organization launched in 2022. Our ambition is to promote and showcase women in Canadian history. We want trailblazers, leaders, authors, and historians to tell stories about women in the labor movement, at work, in the media, women who took to the streets, equal pay, maternity benefit, the right to have your own bank account. We want to get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaign. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the community, provincial, and national levels, across Canada, in small towns, on farms, in urban areas, women who have used their voice to make a difference. This is 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. Michele Landsberg, journalist, author, social justice activist, sought-after speaker, feminist. Born in Toronto in 1939, Michele earned a BA from the University of Toronto in 1962, joining the Globe and Mail the same year and becoming a highly acclaimed journalist. In 1963, she married Stephen Lewis, future leader of the Ontario NDP and future Canadian ambassador to the United Nations. Michele left work when she became pregnant, typical in the day. In 1971, Michele returned to work full-time, working closely with Doris Anderson at the Chatelaine Magazine. In 1978, Michele joined the Toronto Star as a regular columnist on feminist issues for over 25 years, earning 2 national newspaper awards and becoming one of the Star's top-read columnists. Michele is the author of several books, including This is New York, Honey, in 1989, a best-selling memoir of her time living in New York as the wife of a UN ambassador. In 2011, she published Writing the Revolution, a collection of her articles. Throughout her career, Michele pushed for change and incited controversy with her articles that highlighted progressive issues: women and children's rights, issues of equal pay, abortion, sexual harassment in the workplace, racial discrimination. Michele was one of the first journalists to discuss these issues in the public sphere and raising their profile. Michele was awarded the Governor General's Medal in commemoration of the Persons case in 2002 and the Order of Canada in 2006 for being an influential social reformer. And today we're going to be talking to Michele Landsberg. Michele is a renowned, recognized, acknowledged journalist and social justice activist. She has been a regular columnist on feminist issues for all her adult life, for at least 25 years working for the Toronto Star. She's a passionate social critic and voice for women's causes, and you continue to be published and you continue to be an educational speaker. You're still active.
Yes.
So we're going to begin, and I want to start off with, and I was reading last night, this fabulous book, Writing the Revolution. You've written like 3,000 articles, and you took some of the best here. But what I wanted to do is actually describe, I guess, Constance Backhouse described you in the foreword, and it says you are the voice for those without a voice and a beacon of hope. So this is a conversation about your life. The personal is political. And your work at one of Canada's and your work as Canada's most prominent feminist journalist. But we want to start at the beginning. Tell viewers and listeners about your earliest influences and a little bit about that early journey.
I think really what was formative was the extreme conventionality of my upbringing and of everyone's upbringing. I was born in 1939, so I was a kid during the later years of the war, my earliest years, and in the 50s, a terrible decade for girls and women. For example, as a little child with a brother with whom I was very close, 1 year older than I, his life was completely different from mine. He could play outside after dinner. Girls couldn't play outside after dinner. Don't know why, but dangerous or something. And girls had to help with the dishes while the boys went to play. And girls had to be responsible for their brother's well-being. Even though I was younger, I got blamed if my brother did something naughty. Why weren't you watching him? So from the earliest time, it was unequal and unfair. My mother was the sweetest, gentlest woman in the world, so I don't want to give the impression that it was harsh or horrible, but it was different. My upbringing was different from my brother's, and we were so close in age and in everything else that it was notable. So even as a young child, I began to notice. By the time I was about 10 or 11, I was really bothered by these things. And I remember I used to write. I was always a writer. I wanted to be a writer. And I wrote from the time I was about 4. So by the time I was about 10 or 11, I was writing essays to myself, not for anyone else. And I remember writing an essay on the universal use of the pronoun he. Why do they say he when they mean me and the other girls? Why don't they say she instead? Well, he includes she, they would say. Well, she includes he. I mean, I had this whole argument about how that he erased me, and I was angry about it. And I went from there. Language was so vital to me, so important. I loved writing. I loved thinking about language. So language was my entry into this whole debate.
So you were very literal. And you sort of knew what was coming down the pipe. At 10 years old, you had a problem with pronouns.
Yes. I had, by the time I was in high school, I was just disgusted by the expectations. The girls all wore, this was the beginning of the 50s. Don't let anyone tell you that was an idyllic decade. The girls all wore saddle shoes, pleated skirts, blouses with Peter Pan collars and cardigans, and I refused to dress in that conventional way. I borrowed, they didn't make jeans for girls at that time, certainly not in Toronto. I stole my brother's jeans and wore them to school. Yeah, I was very defiant. Not only that, but when I was sent to the principal's office, and this was a man I really looked down on because he made the morning announcements and he was always making grammar mistakes, which just enraged me. But anyhow.
So precocious child.
I was precocious, yeah.
Well, I grew up in the 60s and we had tunics and we didn't like our tunics.
Oh, yes.
But I was part of that group
that was
allowed slacks.
Yes.
Jeans.
Slacks,
but not jeans.
Yeah. Well, when I stole my brother's jeans, I took it a step farther. I was 13. I was smoking Export A cigarettes. And when I was sent to Mr. Young's office, as he was lecturing me about the inappropriateness of wearing jeans, young ladies should not be wearing jeans, I took out a cigarette and a wooden mat and lit the match on my fly and lit up the cigarette. Well, Mr. Young's reaction was explosive. I was suspended for a week. Great. And I think I was too much of a coward to go on wearing the jeans to school, but I had made my statement. I made my point.
So
the
you were
50s,
precocious and a rebel.
And defiant of these silly norms for girls. The silliness. And the whole focus of my fellow students was on the dances, and the Sadie Hawkins dance. And I just had no time for it. I was very buried in literature. I wanted to talk about the books I was reading, but there was nobody else like that around me. I mean, I'm sure there were in the school, but I just didn't find them. So all through the 50s, I was a loner and a rebel. And it was then that I began to develop my insights about feminism.
Very good story. So a rebel, precocious, and loner, and you were really into your literature, your books, your writing at a very young age, which is really, really interesting.
And when I went to university, I did find soulmates who were as keen on literature, of course, as I was. But I couldn't find anyone who quite got my feminism. And I was laughed at by my fellow students. I remember arguing in the first year with a guy who was in one of my classes. We were sitting in the students' lounge, and he said something about there are no great women artists. And I defiantly corrected him and tried to give some examples, pathetically few to my knowledge at that time. And I put up a strong argument about women's equality, which he thought was comical. And the next day, he brought a long ode to school. I think I still have it, of civilized, upscale misogyny, all about how women were naturally inferior to men. You couldn't change nature and so on. And this, was the tenor of the times.
So the whole kind of feminist ideology, I mean, it wasn't really there. This came really natural to you. This was something that really...
Yeah. That's why I call myself a cradle feminist. But I was a tween feminist, not really cradle.
I always took it for granted that girls were equal. I just always took it for granted. My father didn't.
Don't know where. Yeah, see.
My father didn't, but I sort of took it for granted that I was as good as, or sometimes better than.
Yeah.
So, but I grew up in a decade later.
That was a dramatically different decade. Yeah. Yes, it was.
It was. And we'll get to some of that because that's when you really became really very, very active.
Yes.
So you went to university and you fought against the norms there. And then after university, you started with the Globe and Mail.
Yes. I didn't even know how lucky I was, and I didn't even mean to be a journalist. I actually meant to be the second Shakespeare, but that didn't work out.
Good for us. Well done on you.
Anyhow.
We don't need another Shakespeare.
Yeah, one should suffice us all. That's true. So I ended up by pure fluke. I had a boyfriend who was a reporter at the Globe and Mail. He didn't want me to go off to England to continue my studies, so he engineered an excuse for me to write one of the news stories that he was supposed to cover. Some poets, you see, don't know what Toronto was like in those days. It was so awful. It was so white. It was so conventional. It was so oppressive. You couldn't do anything on Sunday but breathe and go to church. Nobody else existed except the Protestant, overclass. So some poets of my acquaintance from university were going to defiantly read their poetry aloud in a park, Allen Gardens, on Sunday. Big whoop, right? So my boyfriend, who was a police reporter, was going to cover this. And he said, I don't know anything about poetry. You do it for me. Well, I don't know anything about journalism, but I could write. So I covered it, wrote a little story about it. He handed it in to his editors and persuaded them to hire me. Hence, I became a journalist.
Your byline, not his.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
No. I think it was his. I can't even remember. That didn't signify to me at the time.
You got a job at the Globe.
I did. And that was wonderful. I did news reporting, and then I became a feature writer. I was assigned to the women's department at that point when I became a feature writer, and I was reluctant, but there was a wonderful editor there, Olive Dickinson, who later in life became a renowned scholar on Métis and Indigenous history. I didn't know Olive was Métis, but she was a wonderful editor and extremely supportive to all my ideas for feature series. I wrote about nurses. I remember that one. I did a huge research into the condition of nurses who were at that time, a registered nurse was paid less than the man who ran the elevator in the hospital. There were elevators with men operating them. Yeah.
I remember elevator operators in Montreal at Ogilvy's.
Yes, that's right. So I was so shocked. And I was shocked that the nurses told me without flinching that their training was that the minute a doctor entered the room, they were to stand up and remain silent. And the nursing teachers told me, yes, indeed, that was enforced. You know, it was the inequality and, in fact, misogyny was built into the system. And I recognized it.
So you took women's features or women's stories, which I'm sure they gave it to, you do the women's stories.
Yeah.
It would be, you do the women's stories.
That's right.
It's not very important. We'll put you in the, secondary section. But you identified and you uncovered a lot of the really horrific sign of the times.
Yes. And to their credit, the Globe didn't flinch in publishing all this stuff. And later when I went to the Star, I spent 7 years at Chatelaine in between. But then I was hired at the Star as a columnist, and it was the same story all over again. Their women's columnist had retired, and the executive editor who interviewed me said, well, we need another woman's columnist. I said, yes, what exactly do you mean by that? And they tell this story in the book. He looked out the window downtown Toronto. He said, see, there's the CN Tower, just been built. If I looked out and saw a man climbing that tower, that would be a news story. If I saw a woman climbing the tower, it would be a women's story. I suppressed my hysterical laughter and said, oh, I see, Marty. And I took the job thinking that they don't know what they've got. And every column I wrote from day one was a feminist column. It was taking news stories or current events and looking at them through a feminist lens. I want to also admit that at that time, there were no women's studies in the universities. I had never been trained in analyzing things from a feminist point of view. However, so I stumbled sometimes. I went back and forth between kind of a liberal, everybody's equal approach to a much more radical approach, depending on the issue. I didn't have a clear and firm analysis yet. I was finding my way.
But it was instinctive, intuitive.
Yeah. Yes.
And what it did was teach everybody that came along after you that these are important issues.
Yes.
And then to, widen the audience and get women and men.
Yes.
Talking about these.
That's right.
These inequalities, the bias, discrimination.
Yes. Yes.
So after the ad hocers and the charter, the section 15, section 28 goes into the Constitution. In November, there's a premier's meeting with the Prime Minister, First Minister's meeting, and they're talking, and Quebec is not wanting to sign this.
Right.
And they came up with the notwithstanding clause.
Which has plagued us to this day.
Yeah, it has.
Yeah. Yes. And so the endless charter fight. Then there was Meech Lake and the Charlottetown Accord. I hated all that stuff. The language was so bureaucratic and you had to plow through these documents. But as a journalist, I had to do it. So.
But the other interesting point was, because those were the days that I was getting politically active. And I did not support Meech Lake or the Charlottetown Agreement. But I had always believed that Canadians were sophisticated and knowledgeable enough that when they had the referendum on the Charlottetown Agreement, I knew that the no side would win. I knew that Brian Mulroney would never get this passed because as dense as it was, people actually understood the importance of...
Really?
Yeah, I had always had the faith in Canadians that they could understand the public discourse around the Constitution. I'm sure there was a lot of ups and downs, but what spurred you on? If we're talking to young people, we want young people to watch this 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. Like, what kept you going? Because there would have been some real highs and lows. Something must have spurred you on, and we haven't talked about your family.
Right?
Married to a phenomenal,
thank you,
public servant and politician.
Well, what spurred me on was my ideals. Ideals I shared with my husband. He came along with my feminism. He didn't have it initially, particularly, but he was an egalitarian. And of all the men I had dated, he was the only egalitarian, so I married.
And you married quite young.
I was 23, and that was regarded as an old maid.
Oh.
Yes. Girls were expected to marry around 18, first baby by 21. And my mother worried I'd overhear her talking with my brother. She's going to be an old maid, I wasn't the least bit interested in getting married. Stephen had to talk me into it. I didn't believe in marriage as an institution.
But what a great partnership. I mean, he would have been so interesting.
Yes.
Dinner conversations.
Exactly.
Trying to spur on these ideas.
Oh, yes. And he made me laugh. He was so witty and funny. His use of language was marvelous. Yeah, we had wonderful conversations. I learned so much from him politically, and he learned so much from me about feminism. As I was working out the issues, I mean, really, I was so lucky. I was writing, when I came to the Star, 5 columns a week. No help, no secretary or anything like that. And I did a lot of research for my columns. So I said to the editor, who can do this? I had 3 small kids at home and no help. So you can imagine how crazy it was. I would be researching all day, interviewing people, running around town, and then write all night. Wow. So the editor said, well, write an easy column a few times a week, funny stuff about your family. Okay, fine. I did that, and it was fun to do that. But I was really spurred on. There was so much injustice all around me every day, especially in the courts. The courts were a nightmare for women. I watched terrible cases, like a woman brutally murdered in front of her 2 small children by a husband who had boasted for weeks at his job that he was going to kill her with this knife that he was sharpening. And he did kill her with that knife. The evidence was all over the place. Blood, fingerprints, everything. And he was acquitted because the defense portrayed the victim as a sexy broad. So she deserved it. She had flirted with someone. It was okay to murder a woman if she flirted with someone else. Not that she did, but that was their hooked up evidence. So that kind of hideous injustice. And then I guess he was Solicitor General or something like that in the provincial government, refused to appeal that verdict. He's now a distinguished judge. And there's so many on the bench who are like that still. They've never been shaken out of their racism or their misogyny. No one's ever forced them to. We used to agitate for judges' education. They made it voluntary. Yes, they did.
But in your book, you go through a lot of the change that happened in your lifetime with women lawyers and women judges, and then it became a critical mass, and now the Supreme Court.
Fabulous, yes, made a big difference.
So you would have seen a lot of change, and you talk a lot in when all your excerpts from your articles. You talk a lot about domestic violence. You talk about, but it's just gender-based violence, and I think you complain about the word gender. It sort of takes away the woman part out of it.
Yes, it does. Yeah, same as rape became sexual assault. Another thing that kind of bothered me.
But this was one of your causes.
Yes.
The violence against women.
Yes, it was. It was so endemic. It's still endemic. It's just been declared an epidemic all these decades later. And the justice system is not equipped to handle it. Many of the judges and criminal lawyers are relying on old misogynist tropes to this day. So that has improved a bit over the years. It was so blatant and so ugly back in the 70s and 80s, but it has improved. Never quite enough.
But for, the whole kind of women's movement has also dramatically changed since.
Yes.
And certainly with the Me Too movement. So you were writing before computers. So
yes.
So you would have done all of this writing about all of these issues.
Yeah.
And then there's the Me Too movement and social media movements now.
Yes.
That really call out people.
That's
and
right.
Really spotlight the issues in a way that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's now more cyber violence. There's more insidious.
Yes.
There's more insidious
hatred.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really sad. And I feel, despite Me Too, which was a great boost, and the Women's March, I feel we have regressed terribly because of social media. There's so much hatred and misinformation spread. It's very dangerous. And I see young women who think of themselves as feminist and who spend a lot of time making sexy pictures of themselves on Instagram, lacy lingerie, whatever. And I'm thinking, what kind of feminist buys into those? We all do to some extent in our clothing, our demeanor, our speech. Of course, we do fit into feminine stereotypes to some degree. But to go to such lengths to promote anti-feminist stereotypes really bothers me. But it's a young generation and I'm not in their shoes. So.
But that's why these stories are really important.
Yeah.
That's what, we didn't get here by accident.
Yeah.
But still they don't know, or some of my young colleagues still don't know how we got here or don't care how we got here.
Yeah.
And I want to say, but, there was a big fight. There was a long struggle. There was a lot of great women. And not just the big women that everybody knows about.
So many.
The women in the communities.
The women who started shelters. Yes. Oh, my God.
I'm going to do a story
wonderful
on
women.
Shelters. I'm going to do a story on women's shelters.
And the abortion march.
Oh, the abortion caravan.
Oh, yes. That's what I meant, the caravan. Yes, it was fantastic. Fantastic, the energy. And that's another thing that kept me going. I was part of a movement. There were things happening all the time, big meetings. Judy Rebick at the Status of Women, not the official Status of Women, our own Status of Women, NAC, National Action Committee on the Status of Women. Big, wonderful conferences where people were energized to go out and protest this or fix that. Yeah, there was a lot of energy and camaraderie. And I was also buoyed by the fact I began writing my column in the Star in 1978. I was immediately flooded with letters, handwritten letters that came in envelopes. Those were the only kind of letters. Women from all over Ontario saying, I love you. That's why I have the temerity to say, to some degree, I was a voice for women who didn't have a platform, didn't have a public position. They wrote me with their stories. I was very early on the scene with the sexual harassment story, a story that a woman who worked on an army base and was brutally sexually exploited by her commander. I was the first to tell her story in the national news, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. I really helped advance the concepts. And one way I did it was, these were new concepts. The first time a book about sexual harassment crossed my desk, I thought, sexual harassment? What now? Oh, for goodness sakes, what nonsense. I resisted a lot of those ideas. Started reading the book and I thought, my God, that's just what happens to all of us. So, I brought those discoveries into my column, and I was careful not to be Miss Know-It-All. I would start by admitting that I had resisted this concept. that it was a difficult one. The same with incest. Nobody believed that incest existed.
Oh, the false memory syndrome.
Oh, that was a terrible era. And yes, nobody. Oh, it was nothing. Maybe a few hillbillies, one of my editors said, down south, you know. And I first wrote about it in the Globe and Mail when I was very young, and I was sent to interview the head of the Children's Aid Society about interracial adoptions. And 5 minutes into the interview, he said, "Never mind, race. Just you tell me, what am I going to do with all those little girls? Take them out of their homes?" I said, "What little girls?" He said, "All over Ontario, I have children being sexually assaulted by their fathers. What am I to do with them? You write about this. I'll give you facts and figures."
Wow.
That's when the editor in the newsroom said, "Oh, maybe a few hillbillies," and I never got to write that story. But that story haunted me. And later, when I had the freedom to write about it in Chatelaine and then the Star, I did. I often think of that terrible time lapse when nobody wrote about it.
You see, that's what's really interesting. You're making issues that some people only think of as concepts because it hasn't happened to them.
Yes.
And young people, because, you know, a lot of young people now some lead very charmed lives. Others,
yes.
There's other issues.
Yeah.
There's more economic issues.
Yes.
You know, there's.
I want to get to that too. Yes.
There's bigger struggles on the economic side. But you brought the stories. You told stories.
Yes.
You showed people that this was real, and it was backed up by some empirical evidence.
Yes. And that's the task of journalism, to make people hear and understand and feel what's somewhat abstract in the news, make them feel it, make them care about it.
And it's not that long ago. So we're talking about, you know, women who are in their late 30s, early 40s, or some of them, you know, could be in their 20s and it happened to their grandmother. Mm-hmm. So, you know, because their grandmothers can be quite young now.
Right.
So you say. Yeah. So, you know, it's just think about your mother's life, or, you know.
Yeah.
You know, I was told by a therapist that, you know, men don't sexually abuse their grandchildren. They typically start with their daughters before they get to their granddaughters.
Yes, that's really a pattern.
So then I started looking at my mother differently. I started looking at my mother and her upbringing. Yeah, what she probably went through. So, so those were the sign of the times.
Yes.
You covered it all. So it's choice and sexual harassment, violence against women,
yes,
children.
Yes,
children's rights.
I had 3 of my own. I loved bringing up my kids, and you know, every year there was a new theory about how to bring up your children, and a lot of them were pretty reactionary. You know, back to the 3 R's. We have a premier who thinks that way now too. so limited. But anyhow, on the education front, I was very passionately involved. I was a volunteer in my children's public school. We went through quite a lot. I wanted to say something earlier about formative influences that is not often recorded about Toronto history. It was a very anti-Semitic town. And as a kid, I wasn't protected by being in the Jewish community, sort of protected and buffered by having lots of other Jewish families around me. We didn't afford to live in some of those communities, so we were in a completely non-Jewish environment, and we were exposed to anti-Semitism from teachers, from the principal of the local school, quite crude and vocal anti-Semitism. In the schoolyard, every Christmas and every Easter, it was Jews killed Jesus, and, you know, other taunts that they learned at church. And so I knew how wrong that was. I wasn't dirty Jew, that was another chant. I was not dirty. My mother was a fanatic on cleanliness, and I didn't kill Jesus. I had nothing to do with him. Anyhow, he was Jewish, and they know that. And, you know, from such an early age, I was at odds with the common understood knowledge of society.
That was that, but then it became that intersection, what they talk about intersectionality now. So
it was intersectionality for sure. And that's why I was so alive to the race issue when that started coming along. I couldn't get my bosses at the Star at the beginning to even see it. I was being honored by something or other. The publisher of the Star invited me up to a little lunch in his private dining room, and he had a couple of the senior editors there. Oh, congratulations, Michele. And what do you see we could change at the Star? And I said, well, look around the newsroom. They're all white. And the publisher was quite taken aback, and he challenged the editor-in-chief and said, well, what can you do about that, Marty? We want to appeal to all the suburban readers, too. We want to get everybody in reading the Star. Well, said the editor, I've tried, but there aren't any who are qualified. How can you imagine?
So, but one of the big criticisms about the women's movement in the 1970s was the fact that it was Toronto-centric. It was, the middle class, upper middle class women who led it. And there wasn't a lot of intersectionality. And so I've heard both sides. Yes, there was, but the white women didn't really like us anyway. And then there's so what was it like? I mean, because if race is so important, even women's issues, it's bad for, violence against women is bad for women, but it's even worse for Indigenous women, or even worse for Black women.
Yes. And I think most of us were happily oblivious to these issues back in the 70s. And my readers began to educate me about it. I realized how mingled these issues were. And I can give you a little example that really shocked me awake. Around domestic violence, people always say, why doesn't she leave? Well, I said, of course, and many have repeated this idea, not just me. Why doesn't he stop? Why is it the woman's fault? And then there was the question of not reporting to police. And I wrote a column in which I suggested that women should really, I know there are difficulties, but if they don't report to police, we're never going to stop this scourge of domestic violence. And I got a call from a woman of color who explained to me that at that time, particularly in Toronto and in her neighborhood, if a woman called police on her husband, they might well shoot him or drag him off to jail. It would be severe, harsh consequences just because of police bigotry. I was stunned that I hadn't even recognized that imbalance, that inequality. And that really made me pay attention on every issue. Well, what's the question for women of color here? And I began to educate myself a bit. And I would deny that the movement was so white and so middle class. I can remember lots of working class women that I was proud to know in the movement. Union women were tremendous. And there were Black women that I knew. Maybe there should have been a lot more. But believe me, as we scrambled around, we weren't out there recruiting and looking for who qualified to be a member. It was ad hoc. It was loosey-goosey. Whoever wanted to come to the meeting came. And we didn't have the resources to go out searching for people who ought to be there. So yes, maybe there ought to be more. But I remember when Gloria Steinem came to Toronto to give a speech in the late 70s, she brought Florence Kennedy, the wonderful lawyer, with her, Black woman, and they had equal space on the platform. And I realized that Gloria was doing this deliberately. Everywhere she went, she had a wonderful Black feminist with her. And that was the late 70s. I don't think the movement was always racist. We could have all done better, for sure.
But then also you were better informed, and I would expect that when you talked about any issues, you did ask that question. How is it for?
I did try. I have lots of lapses, for sure. I'm no I had a saying that I developed as I wrote the column: nobody gets a free pass out of the culture. We were all brought up in the same culture. And it's a lifelong work to undo those preconceptions. And I was certainly no exception. I had to work at every one of them. I remember when incest, I had tried to deal with it at the Globe when I was 23. Now it came up again. A woman in the States had written the very first book about being an incest survivor. She came up to Toronto, and none of the book people would interview her. The publisher phoned me and said, please, would you do something? Nobody wanted to touch this subject. And I was very queasy about it. I thought, oh, do I really want to talk about this over dinner? I had my own preconceptions. I went to dinner with this woman, a lovely, intelligent woman, and she turned me around. I saw things that I hadn't seen before. How those children suffered, how
or blocked it out.
But even that effort of blocking it out took a toll on their creativity, on their lives, their freedom.
Shame in it.
Yeah.
There's shame in it.
Yeah. So I really learned from everyone I interviewed and grew.
And then the children's rights, you did a lot of work around that.
Yes.
Are there still any issues that you thought were overlooked, or they just didn't get it despite your advocacy? What were your biggest disappointments?
Biggest disappointment looking back on the movement, and I can't say I put it together then. It's gradually come to me over the years since. There was a failure to weave economic understanding into our feminist ideology. Capitalism is the root and ground and structure of inequality and poverty and misogyny. And we did not tackle that in our movement, very little. Nowadays, I think that would be a major part of the analysis, and it should be. And I think I remember Bella Abzug. I belong to a group in New York that celebrates a feminist version of the Passover Seder every year. We've been doing it for more than 40 years. Gloria was a member of the group. Bella Abzug was a member. And in the last time she attended, shortly before she died in 98, she suddenly made this impassioned speech. And she said, sisters, we have completely failed. And we were all shocked because we all thought feminism had accomplished a lot, right? She said, if we had succeeded in the way we should have, there would be 100,000 women marching on Washington and demanding an end to poverty. There is no reason for poverty to exist, and we haven't fought it as we should have. And she went on to make this powerful speech. It was then that I thought, damn, we didn't integrate the nature of capitalism, the nature of the economy that includes us all, right?
Yeah.
We didn't include that in our analysis nearly enough.
It would have been a much different kind of debate and discussion. It would have been a bigger Titanic to turn around.
Yes, it would have.
There's some things that, what is the art of the possible?
Yeah.
And that just would have been one
more barrier.
one more mountain to climb that you couldn't get to the top.
But
there are now conversations about women in prosperity or women and economic security. And now there are discussions about poverty.
Yes.
At least we're in Canada and we're not in the United States.
Yes.
Where at least we got the social safety net and some of
to
the social
some
programs
degree.
To
yeah.
some degree. It's not great, but it's a lot better. And depending on the government of the day.
Yeah.
Some governments are better than others at doing it.
Yes, indeed.
I think trying to get out of a capitalist
system
would be just
very difficult. But
very difficult.
I will point to the fact that thanks to the climate change protesters, they have brought capitalism into the conversation in a very serious and profound way. And we can see how race and feminism, all these things are part of that conversation and intertwined. And so many things that women got blamed for, or we blamed the children's aid for not giving enough money to the children, or, they were part of the whole economic structure. And we didn't tackle that bigger picture. And partly because women of those era, very few undertook the study of economics and finance. We didn't understand it or care about it, so we didn't see the bigger picture. Wish we had. That's a regret.
But we now have, interestingly, at this point in time, a government that has, the cabinet is half women, as opposed to one or two back in the 70s and 80s. A lot of the women are in economic portfolios, including, Chrystia Freeland, but they are now holding onto some of those really substantive positions. They're no longer just doing status of women or consumer corporate affairs.
Yes.
They've got.
Yes, that's right.
And I remember Monique Bejean talking to me about what she tried to do as Minister of National Revenue.
Yes.
And trying to bring in like the child tax.
Yes.
So I remember her talking to me about that. So it's not great, but women are now better placed.
Well, that's true, but it's having half the cabinet be women is important symbolically. I'm not sure all of them are feminists. Having a woman in power doesn't interest me. Having a feminist in power is what I care about. And a woman in power is no different from a man in power. Part of the establishment, same economic interests, same culture, same background. If she's a feminist, she's analyzing all that and able to reject some of it. But if she's not a feminist, what good does it do the rest of us to have her have a position of power? So, and even like Barack Obama, at the end of his time, had he materially changed things for Black people in America? I don't think so. I don't think he even touched that issue or got close to the issue of poverty, despite the health plan. That was important. But,
they haven't talked.
Just having a symbolic person doesn't change things. It's part of the plan, but it's...
So the part of the biggest disappointment is bringing in those economic issues and making them...
Yes.
A little bit more feminist, a little bit more... That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I want to talk a little bit, and then we're going to close shortly. You married Stephen. We talked a little bit about Stephen, and so not only was he leader of the NDP, but of course, then he went off to New York.
Yes.
And you lived in New York.
Oh, that was so great.
This is New York, honey.
Thank you, Brian Mulrooney. It was funny to hear me say that, right? But when Stephen was appointed ambassador to the UN, I was at his elbow. He was on the phone hearing from Brian Mulrooney this proposal. And I was hearing bits of it. Oh, the United Nations? Oh, yes, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm quite interested in... Yes, yeah. And I was like, the UN, New York. Yeah, Stephen, yes. And it's like... And then he was given 12 hours to consider the proposal, not allowed to talk to anyone but me about it. So by morning, I had persuaded him that he wouldn't be doing this for Brian Mulrooney and the Conservative Party. He would be doing it for Canada.
And he tackled some really big issues.
Huge issues.
The HIV issue.
Before that, Africa. He'd always been passionate about Africa, spent 2 years there as a young man, and so eager to get more justice for Africans. And he had a very significant role at the UN in leading the African push,
And then in your book, you covered in the book excerpts from your
columns.
Took columns about the violence about women in war-torn countries and Africa. So you brought a lot of that. You brought a lot of his life and his interest in Africa into your own writing.
Yes, indeed, because we influence each other all the time. I always learn from him, and it was lively. Another thing that I like to give him a lot of credit for is that from the beginning of writing the column, I was under tremendous pressure. This hadn't been done before. I was doing 5 a week. writing like mad all through the night before making breakfast and packing lunches and all, And he always, no matter where he was through the years, he would read my column before I sent it in and tell me if I had made myself clear. He never tried to change anything, but he'd say, I don't think you're making your point clear. Try again. It was so supportive. And most of the time he just said, that's terrific, go for it. But, sometimes he disagreed with me. We'd have lively exchanges, which influenced how I would explain my view. So he was just the best editor in the world for me. I was so fortunate to have someone non-competitive, very supportive, and on the same, path.
A great
love
story.
Yeah.
Story about meeting of
Truly.
How wonderful.
Yeah, I was so fortunate in that.
And you're still married.
Oh, yes, we're still married. 60 years, or is it 61? Soon be 61.
Between the time writing your first column for the Globe and your last column, what was the greatest difference in how you were able to speak about, or what you were able to speak about, how you were able to speak about it, and compare it with some of the issues today? Like, what was that one achievement? What's your legacy?
Yikes. I think the thing that touched me the most overall was how many women said I changed their lives. I'm 85. I still get women coming up to me on the street now and then saying, you're Michele, aren't you? You changed my life. Whether I wrote about a nursing school for older women that they hadn't known about, or incest, or possibilities of getting out of a violent marriage, how to do it. The fact that I touched the readers' lives so that they could change in some way, that's an amazing privilege. Just amazing. I felt I landed in the luckiest job on earth, really. I could write about stuff I cared about for my whole life, and I did.
Well, now I have the luckiest job in life because I get to interview people. And then the last question is going to be, what would you tell your younger self? If you have to do it all over again, is there a shortcut? What would you tell your younger
self?
Yeah. I know what I tell myself.
Really?
Yeah, do it faster.
Do it faster.
Be louder.
Be louder.
Be louder, do it faster.
I think I was as loud as I could possibly be. I would say, learn more. I should have learned more about economics and the world situation and understood the bigger context that shaped us all into these silly stereotypical roles that men and women have inherited. I think learning more would have been wonderful. When I was 40, I had begun writing. I'd been writing furiously for a couple of years at the Star, and I applied for a Massey Fellowship. Mm-hmm. I needed to learn more. I felt that. I wanted to spend a year learning economics, whatever. And I was turned down for it on the grounds that I was too old at 40. It was meant for young people. I explained to the person who was in charge of it, who called me, I said, women have a different trajectory. We take some years out to raise the children, so we're a bit later getting to these things. No, that didn't matter. So I didn't get that year to study. I regret that.
But now we think that 70 is the new 40.
Yes. And 85 is the new something or other.
You don't have to retire at 60. I had a friend say to me, Debbie, aren't you retired? And I'm going, no.
Why should you?
He goes, doesn't the government retire you at 65? And I'm going,
no,
anymore.
That's been outlawed. I'm happy to say.
So,
yes.
Just, keep getting paid.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Well, I'm not getting paid anymore, but I do pay attention to what's happening in the world and try to pitch in my bit. So
I want to thank you, really. I want to thank you so much for this. As I say, I have the luckiest job because I get to interview people like you.
Thank you, Deborah.
That's made me a much better person. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you, Deborah.
I'm Deborah Davis, president and co-founder of the Women's History Project. This has been the Women's History Project production.
with thanks to our sponsors, partners, and special guests. Please like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. You can find out more about our first season of 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories on our website, www.womenshistoryproject.ca.